Thank you. It's always great when you open the agenda and you see you're right after lunch. And so we've turned the thermostat to 75 and are going to drone at you, and we'll see what happens. I want to acknowledge Mike Podgorski. He's a professor at the University of Missouri, but board member at the St. Louis Chess Club as well. He's also a big contributor to this work, a big supporter of chess research. And a huge thank you to the St. Louis Chess Club, which underwrote this work, and then USCF as well, which provided the data for us. So a quick overview. Our paper investigates a male-female ratings gap in chess. It uses all USCF data from 2000 to 2019, and we limit it to young kids, ages 3 to 15. So it's if you have students and they're 3 to 15, they're in our data and they're in this investigation. We're going to talk at you at a undergrad stats level. We do have a working paper, which you can find on Ed Working Papers. And so I'd encourage you, if you want to geek out and really get into the math, and download this working paper. It is under review and resubmit at the Journal of Sports Economics. We just got that last week and are working on revisions, and so expect to have it out in a peer-reviewed publication soon. And just real quick as a motivation, I'm glad that we went more broad on games in chess, because we see a lot of this is going to be focused on a chess audience. But our focus is more broad. And there's a very robust literature out there on games in sports and the male-female difference. And games are just this perfect place to investigate this because you have great data, natural conditions, don't have to set anything up. There's one paper that we've looked at that looks at how males and females respond to blunders differently. But blunders is operationalized as a double fault in tennis. So that's just a good anecdote that shows that we're situating this in the broader knowledge of sports research in specifically male-female differences, with the hope that maybe someday we'll be able to say something about the challenges in the gap in females in STEM fields, and maybe even investigating the nature-nurture difference. So let me see. There have been a number of hypotheses put forward in terms of why there's a male-female ratings gap. The first one is this issue of large numbers. If you have a huge number of folks, there's going to be a lot more outliers within your males, right? And we have, with our data, we ran a bunch of Monte Carlo simulations, have pretty conclusively said this is not the reason. And we'll go a little bit more into that. But we do not think this is a large numbers issue. Higher female attrition, that's certainly true. That's been investigated, and we'll talk about that. Differences in style of play, aggressiveness is one that's commonly operationalized, and there's papers on that. Grandmaster and Professor Smearden from Australia does a lot of good work on this. And then discrimination, which would lead to lower returns. Do males and females grow at the same rate during their tenure? So our data allows us to investigate some of these. There are limitations. We cannot do everything with our data, but we are able to make some pretty conclusive statements about what we see in USCF data from 2000 to 2019. And those data, again, it's everybody, it's actually ages 3 to 15. Over this, the timeline of this panel, it's 106,000 players. And you see that far right column is a percent female by year, which varies between 14 and 18%. So looking at these data, this is called a cumulative distribution function. And I'll just introduce this and then turn it over to my colleague, Michelle. This is what we looked at is we wanted to first say, where does this gap exist? A lot of the research occurs on the right tails to say there's clearly a gap at our grandmasters levels. But this clearly shows that there's a gap across the entirety of the distribution as your median student and with your newbies. As soon as we see them, and when do we see them? We see them right at their 25th game when they've received an established player. We did look in the first 24 games, and these conclusions still hold. But for our paper, we said we're only doing it 25 games and ahead. So now I'm going to turn it over to Michelle. She's going to talk to you about 4 different things that we specifically investigated to say what contributes to this pattern.
Hi, everybody. I'd like to thank you all again for having us here to talk today. As Matthew said, I will try not to mess up with the clicker too much, but I don't promise you anything. Oh. Okay. I'll talk loud. And let's see if,
there it is.
There we go. Okay, my hair. We figured this out. So we've seen there's this big grading gap, right? You're seeing it back here at the 20th percentile, at the 80th percentile of these new players. There's a big gap. And so this paper is going to really explore 4 hypotheses as to why we think this is happening. Our first, most salient explanation is that this gap is occurring when players are first established in their rating, meaning that they've played these 25 games. But we're also going to explore 3 alternative hypotheses. First, there's this explanation out there, well, maybe girls aren't as good as boys naturally at playing the game, and therefore they're not going to grow as fast. So we're going to check out what the return to experience is for male and female players. We're also going to explore attrition, which means the dropout rate. I've talked to several of you here today, and you've all told me about the fact that you see kids playing, and they're young, and they're kindergartners, first graders, second graders, and it looks the same, and then suddenly you hit 4th, 5th, 6th grade, and where'd the girls go? They're gone. So does this affect that gap that we're seeing? And finally, we're going to look at the share of female participants in your local home area, and how does that affect you as a young player developing? If there's a whole bunch of girls in the chess club and you're playing with them, does that impact your development, your practice time, something with your environment, compared with if it looks like a boys' club and everybody there's a boy and you're a little girl that walks in? How does that change your environmental impact, and how does that affect the gap that we're observing? So to start off, we're going to look at a graph. This is a quantile graph, but what this says is that lower rated players are towards the left-hand side, higher rated players are towards the right-hand side. So we stacked up every single player and said, player 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1,000, 2,000. You're all in a row. What does your rating look like at each percentile? And we did that for both male and female players, and then we looked at the difference between them. So what you can see is at the 20th percentile, the gap is around 125 points. Move up to just the 40th or 50th percentile, and you see that the gap is at 150 points. And this is at the first year of establishment. So these kids have played 25 rated games, and this is our gap immediately. Here's the gap, everybody. It comes in right at establishment. Yeah. That's where it is. But we're going to check out some other possible explanations. So we've seen that there's this gap at the beginning, but what does the return to experience look like? Again, right after lunch, I know everybody's excited for their college level stats course, but okay, I love stats, so this is great. This table is going to show us how players grow. So our first column is everybody lumped together. Our next 3 columns are going to separate groups of players based on what their ratings were in their 3rd year of play. So column 2 is the 20th to 50th percentile, column 3 is the 50th to 90th percentile, and then column 4 is at 90th to 99th percentile. So we can look at, again, lower rated players versus higher rated players, and we're going to see what different aspects of their play is going to affect their actual rating and how that grows. So in column 1, I want everybody to look up top. That's games from this year and last year. How many games you played that were rated? everybody gains about 2 points per game played on average. This is true for low-rated players. This is true for high-rated players. It doesn't change by that much. So conditional on that, we know everybody's growing about that space. How is that different for females? If it's positive, then that means that they're growing faster than their male counterparts. If it's negative, it means that they're growing slightly slower. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily declining, right? We're still in a positive number growth. What we see here is that female cross games, females basically grow at the same level as males. That number is really close to 0, right? Pretty tiny. We see those boys and girls growing at the same rate. So this tells us that there's not some different ability level or potential growth difference. So we've knocked that one out of the park, right? So we've seen that there's this gap at establishment. We've seen that there is not a difference in return to experience for males and females. We're going to next look at the idea of males and females dropping out at different rates. So we have a nice little graph here. It's a bar chart with a line. You're going to notice that every year of play, we're observing fewer and fewer people playing. So people drop out. This is year 1 versus year 5, year 10. That's getting smaller. And that orange line represents, each orange bar represents male players. Blue bars represent female players. The important thing to note is the green line that's declining. And that tells us that female attrition is higher than males. So they're dropping out faster than your male counterparts. Now, everybody in here has basically told me that you've observed this teaching chess that I've talked to. The question was, does this affect your distribution? And the short answer is no. Oh, well. So, again, a bunch of different graphs. These are going to show the distributions of male and female players by years of play. The reds are females, the blues are males. This is going to be kind of hard to tell about the lines. But if you look at year 1 and the distance between the left line and the right line, that's your gap in year 1 at the mean. At year 10, you can see that that gap looks pretty similar. It's shifted, but the gap looks basically the same thing at year 12, which is as far out as we went with this group. So yes, females are attriting faster. They're dropping out faster. But that's not changing the gap, which we were somewhat surprised by, I think. But it was a pretty cool, fascinating finding. Our final hypothesis that we're going to look at is the share of females among young participants and how the local share of females in your area is going to affect the environment that a young female player faces and a young male player faces. So again, you're thinking about kids at your local chess clubs. What does the makeup of that chess club look like? And how does that impact the ratings of these young players? Well, at least I'm consistent, if nothing else. So this graph is a quantile regression result. We're not going to go into it. If you'd like to read the paper again and read some nitty-gritties about quantile regressions, it's a great read. But on the beginning points of this, what this says is that female players are performing better when there's more females in your areas. But for males, the stronger, and I'm pointing down to my screen, the stronger players are going to do worse. So this is kind of an odd finding, but we're going to stay agnostic on it, I think. But it does point to suggest that there's potential to reduce the gap, at least somewhat, by increasing the number of female players in an area. Brian, would you like to?
You want me to take over now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Testing. All right, thank you. So I'm going to summarize because then we want to go, we want to try to get into a conversation with you because a lot of you are involved with these chess clubs, and I think that you can see some of these things with your own eyes, and you might have strategies and things that we might want to think about it. And this is like a really important question because people kind of use these sort of top-level results that we see to make sort of like passive-aggressive accusations about things. I remember it was a couple of years ago, there was some chess finding showing, you know, sort of the disparity in grandmasters between males and females. And Elon Musk did that thing that he does where he retweets it and he says, interesting. But what he's suggesting is that he thinks that females don't have the same ability as males to play chess. And there's not a thing in this research question that we're looking at that can support that contention. We find that the gap is there from the beginning, which suggests something about the pipeline through which we're attracting players to get into this game. I think one of the most unique, and look, other people have looked at this stuff, but one of the most unique things that we've done in this research, and you know, Michelle is understating the sort of like level of statistics in question number 2, but looking at the returns to experience. What we're saying is, what we're actually doing is we're isolating a chess player in a fixed effects regression model, and we're saying like, for every game you play, you know, what does this do for your overall rating? How much do you improve? And males and females are improving at the exact same rates. So the contention there is that if they played the same, if they practiced the same amount, we wouldn't see these gaps and we wouldn't see these disparities. Attrition, well, we think that attrition is something that maybe because of the way that the game is a boys' club, that maybe the top female players are more likely to drop out. We find out that that's not the case. If anything, the attrition seems to make the gap a little bit less. But then this last finding that we have really gets into a conversation about what the culture is and what the sort of like environment is. And so with that last question, what we're looking at is, well, if there's more female players in a zip code is what we're specifically looking at there, we find out that female students do better, female chess players. And so this goes into a few research questions that we have ongoing. This is where Ben comes in, who's doing some of this ongoing research work. So all the stuff that we've been doing so far is at this sort of like high aggregate level where we're looking at hundreds of thousands of players. Now we're going to start looking at millions of games, and we're looking at things at the games level. We're looking at actual people competing with each other across the board. So we're taking this question a little bit step further. We're looking at, well, what does the male-female ratio look like, and what is the effect of that on female play at the tournament level? So not the zip code, which might be a function of just the type of community you live in, but the actual sort of like chess environment that you're in when you're in those tournaments. Is there an impact if there's a higher female ratio on performance and shrinking these gaps? You'll have to wait to get those results. We're looking at variation in the quality of play and just like the type of play. So we're going to look at like whether or not there's more aggressive plays, more sort of like what you might call offensive playing versus defensive playing, and if this might be one of those explanations. We're looking at, with some of the work that Ben's helping with us, like what is the sort of like reaction to losing or making a blunder, and if that's something that is more likely to cause you know, sort of like you've seen this, like we see this in all kinds of sports, right? Like somebody misses a field goal, then they miss the next field goal because they're nervous about it, or you miss a basketball shot. So we're looking at that, and with these things, we're getting into like the really like, you know, so far we've been looking at the forest. We're trying to like narrow down and look at the trees. And so this is all the things that we're looking at moving forward. But the number one thing, do I advance the slide past this? No, I can't advance the slide past this one. But the number one thing, and like the basic finding that we have, and I think it's, you know, it's kind of supported across the board, is if this is something that we care about, if we really want to make sure that these young female chess players can compete at the highest level, it has to do with pipelines. Which means it has to do with a lot of the people in this room and the work that you're doing, because you're in the job of recruiting and maintaining the space where we would want to actively try to bring more young girls into this game.